That number did not come from hotel rooms. It is not from service fees. It is not from host commissions. Not from anything Airbnb has ever put in a consumer facing advertisement. $721 million came from holding your money. Here is what Airbnb never told you. When you book a stay, Airbnb charges your credit card immediately, the full amount, right then. But the host does not get paid until 24 hours after you check in. Sometimes that gap is days. Sometimes it is weeks. Sometimes it is months. In the time between those two moments, while your money sits inside the system, Airbnb takes every dollar it has collected from every guest on every booking across the entire planet, and it parks that money in United States Treasury bills, earning interest every hour without telling you. In 2023 alone, that interest income reached $721 million. That is not revenue from connecting guests to hosts. That is revenue from the gap. The float, the structural delay between your credit card and your host's bank account, scaled across 500 million bookings. That year, the shadow treasury operation generated 28% of Airbnb's entire reported operating profit. It is not a side business. It is not a footnote. It is not a rounding error. Almost a third of their bottom line from holding your money. Now here is the question this video was built to answer. How does a company that owns zero properties, zero hotels, zero apartments, zero mattresses become one of the most profitable financial operations in Silicon Valley without ever once calling itself a bank? And why, if the float is this valuable, did it nearly go bankrupt in 2020? Who arrived with $1 billion at 10% interest? And what did that moment reveal about everything this company actually is? There is a third question, a harder one. When a company's single most profitable operation depends on holding your cash for as long as possible, what does that tell you about every other decision it makes? About the safety incidents it buries under NDAs? About the taxes it refuses to pay for 6 straight years? About the rapes it settles in secret and the fires it refuses to inspect for? The float explains everything. Stay. Strategy Lens is where we do this every week. We take the world's biggest corporations and strip the public narrative down to what is actually happening inside the machine. Not the press releases, not the earnings call talking points, the mechanics, the architecture, the thing they did not want you to see. If you want to understand how power actually moves through the global economy, this channel exists for you. Subscribe. The next one may be more relevant than this one. It started with a math problem. San Francisco, 2007. Brian Chesky is 26 years old. He has just moved into an apartment he cannot afford. His landlord has just raised the rent by 25%. His bank account contains $1,000. The rent due is $1,150. $150 short. His roommate, Gebbia, sends him an email the same week. An industrial design conference is arriving in the city. Every hotel in San Francisco has sold out. Designers are flying in from across the world with nowhere to stay. Chesky and Gebbia see a gap. Not a platform, not a startup, a gap. A very specific, very local mismatch between available floor space and desperate travelers. They buy 3 inflatable mattresses. They build a WordPress page. They call it Airbed and Breakfast. They charge $80 a night. First 3 guests, a professional from India, a woman 35 to 40 from Boston, a father of 4 from Utah, all paid $80, all gave 5 stars. This is the detail most analysts skip, and it is the most important detail of the founding. Their first guests were not budget travelers, not college students hunting for a cheap couch, a professional male traveling internationally for work, a 35-year-old woman, a father traveling with his family. All 3 paid $80. All 3 came back with positive feedback. Before a single venture capitalist had seen a pitch deck, the model had proved something the founders themselves may not have fully articulated. The demand was not niche. It was not youth market. It was professional. It was family. It was global. And it was willing to pay a real price. But proof of concept is not a business. And the next 12 months nearly ended the whole thing. The 2008 Democratic National Convention brought 200,000 visitors to Denver. Chesky, Gebbia, and their new co-founder, Nathan Blecharczyk, a Harvard-trained software architect who brought technical rigor, launched on the convention. They got 50 bookings, barely enough to notice. Then the financial crisis hit. Venture capital evaporated. One investor described rejecting the Airbnb pitch by saying he was afraid to even write it in his journal. The concept that strangers would share their homes was not just turned down, it was treated as a category error, an idea too socially implausible to fund. In 2009, Airbnb was generating only $200 per week in revenue. Multiple VCs declined, calling the idea fundamentally unsafe. Paul Graham at Y Combinator accepted them anyway, and Graham's critical directive, do things that do not scale, sent the founders to New York City. What they found was not a technology problem, it was a trust problem. The listing photographs looked like they had been taken in the dark with a disposable camera. Blurry images of spaces that looked uninviting. So Chesky and Gebbia rented a camera. They personally visited every host in New York City. They photographed the spaces themselves, with light, with composition, with the kind of care that makes a stranger believe a space is real and safe. Booking rates doubled, then tripled. The product had not changed. The trust signal had changed. And that discovery that the fundamental friction was not price, but belief, became the philosophical foundation of the entire business. By mid 2008, the founders were not metaphorically living on cereal. They had a surplus of politically branded breakfast boxes. They sold hundreds of boxes at $40 each, generating $30,000 in non-dilutive capital. The press found it charming. CNN covered it. The cereal campaign is usually told as a quirky startup anecdote. The strategic reality is more instructive. $30,000 bought them time. In 2009, Sequoia Capital led a seed round at a $600,000 valuation. The company moved to a real platform. And then, quietly, something structural began to form inside the business that would eventually become its most valuable and its least discussed asset. Guests paid in full at the time of booking. Hosts got paid after the guest arrived. That gap, that float, looked like a payment logistics detail in 2009. But the float was not only a financial asset, it was a liability, a vulnerability. And the day that vulnerability was exposed, April 2020. We will get there. But first, the rise. Because before you understand how the cracks formed, you need to understand just how high the tower was built. By 2012, Airbnb had listings in 192 countries. By 2014, it had surpassed Hilton in total rooms available globally. By 2017, a private equity consortium valued it at $31 billion, making it at that moment the most valuable privately held startup in American history after Uber. That trajectory was not accidental. And it was not simply because people wanted affordable places to stay. The moat nobody could buy. Every marketplace business lives or dies on two supply-side problems: getting inventory and keeping it. Airbnb solved both simultaneously by turning hosts into stakeholders in the platform's success. The bidirectional review system, where both guests and hosts publicly review each other, tied to verified booking records, generated what the company now holds as the world's largest trust ledger. Over 1 billion verified, time-stamped, cross-referenced reviews. Not hotel star ratings selected by a marketing team. Verified accounts. Real people, real stays, real outcomes. 1 billion plus verified reviews, a competitive moat no new entrant can replicate in less than a decade. You cannot buy that database, you cannot build it in 2 years, you cannot acquire it. It is 15 years of behavioral metadata. Who trusted whom, under what conditions, with what result. It is the single reason 80% of Airbnb's traffic arrives organically, without paying Google a single dollar. Booking Holdings spent $8.8 billion on marketing in 2025 to drive traffic. Airbnb spent a fraction of that, and 60% of what it did spend was brand advertising, not search arbitrage. When you become the verb, when people say they are Airbnb-ing it, the way they say just Google it, you stop paying the toll. Airbnb became the toll. Three strategic moves nobody fully credits. First, the domestic pivot during COVID. When international travel collapsed in March 2020, Airbnb's competitors fell into operational crisis. Expedia's market cap dropped 60%. Booking Holdings lost nearly half its value. Airbnb was burning $250 million a month. But something happened in the data. Rural and suburban domestic bookings were not collapsing at the same rate. Families in dense urban centers were seeking space. The pandemic had not eliminated the desire to travel, it had redirected it. Families were fleeing cities to rent cabins, beach houses, farmhouses, and mountain properties, all inventory types that Airbnb held in abundance, that faced zero immediate regulatory exposure, and that were completely unavailable on any hotel platform in the world. Airbnb did not engineer this pivot. They recognized it in their own booking data and leaned into it. But the ability to lean into it, the reason they survived when competitors did not, was the breadth of their supply. 9 million listings across every category means that when one category collapses, something else is usually moving. That is not luck. That is a network effect large enough to function as a natural hedge. Second, slashing performance marketing in 2021. Airbnb's competitors emerged from COVID spending aggressively on Google Ads, attempting to recapture demand through search arbitrage. Airbnb did the opposite. They cut their performance marketing budget dramatically and shifted to brand advertising, the kind that builds cultural identity. Sales and marketing as a percentage of revenue. Airbnb 16.2%, Booking Holdings 38.5%, Expedia 42.1%. The difference is structural superiority, not just efficiency. The consequences were structural and lasting. Airbnb's sales and marketing spend today sits at 16.2% of revenue. Booking Holdings 38.5%. That is not a small difference in operational efficiency. That is a different category of competitive moat. It means that every dollar of revenue Airbnb earns costs a fraction of what it costs its competitors to generate. The gap compounds. Third, the zero coupon convertible notes. In early 2021, weeks after the IPO, Airbnb issued $2 billion in convertible senior notes at a 0% interest rate. Institutional investors, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, fixed income asset managers handed Airbnb $2 billion at no cost for 5 years. The research that underpins this documentary describes this move as, quote, one of the greatest corporate treasury heists in modern Silicon Valley history. That is not hyperbole. It is an accurate description of what happened. At 0% interest for 5 years, while the Fed raised rates to 5.5%, the annual savings compared to market rates was over $110 million. But here is what it all looks like in hindsight. Every one of those structural advantages, the direct traffic, the zero coupon notes, the shadow treasury, the marketing efficiency, they are built on the same foundation. Every one of them is made possible by the same mechanic that was encoded into the business model the day a 26-year-old put 3 air mattresses on a floor in San Francisco. Guests pay first. Hosts get paid later. The gap is the whole business, not the website, not the algorithm, not the experiences tab. The gap, the float, the structural delay that generates $9.2 billion of held deposits at any given moment and invests them in government securities while the host waits for their money. When you understand the gap, when you trace every major decision back to the incentive structure that the gap creates, the story stops looking like an inspiring startup narrative. It starts looking like the deliberate construction of a very specific kind of machine. And that machine has a board. 3 men control 80% of the votes. One of them had a CFO who understood the machine better than anyone else in the building, who wanted to take it public, impose discipline, and impose accountability. That CFO is gone now. The story of why he left explains more about Airbnb than any earnings report. In 2015, Brian Chesky hired Laurence Tosi as Chief Financial Officer. Tosi arrived from Blackstone Group, one of the most powerful private equity operations in the world. He was brought in to do one thing: professionalize Airbnb and take it public. What followed was 3 years of documented philosophical warfare inside the company's executive layer. Tosi was a disciplined Wall Street operator. He wanted acquisition targets and unit economic accountability. In late 2017, he advanced negotiations to acquire Flipkey, TripAdvisor's short-term rental platform, to a near final stage. Chesky killed the deal at the last minute and refused to schedule a meeting with TripAdvisor's CEO. Tosi had been working on the deal for months. He was left humiliated in front of the board. Tosi wanted the IPO in 2018. S1 paperwork had been drafted. Chesky publicly declared that Airbnb had an infinite time horizon. Meanwhile, investigative reports confirmed that internal proposals included an Airbnb branded commercial airline. This was the environment Tosi was navigating. A CEO who killed rational acquisition targets and resisted every mechanism of financial discipline. Tosi had also built something inside Airbnb's treasury, an active yield management operation, trading portions of the corporate cash to generate return. This is important context. The shadow treasury was not invented by the post-IPO team. Its intellectual roots trace to Tosi's internal yield operation. The coup happened on January 29, 2018. Without advance notice, Chesky promoted Belinda Johnson directly to Chief Operating Officer. Tosi learned of the appointment that day. That evening, he submitted his resignation. 2 days later, Chesky published a public manifesto. What Chesky said was idealism. What he did structurally was eliminate the last internal voice capable of challenging him. And when Airbnb finally went public in December 2020, it went public in a governance structure that ensured no external voice could challenge him either. Airbnb's IPO gave public investors Class A shares, 1 vote per share. Brian Chesky, Nathan Blecharczyk, and Joe Gebbia hold Class B shares, 20 votes per share, together 80.6% of total votes. Any shareholder vote they oppose fails automatically. Vanguard can hold $20 billion of stock. BlackRock can hold $15 billion. If the three founders vote against it, the motion fails. The check does not exist. In February 2025, co-founder Joe Gebbia accepted a formal appointment to the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE. Among the agencies it was targeting, the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Labor, the same agencies investigating Airbnb's practices. The conflict of interest was grotesque. A controlling fiduciary of a public company sitting on an advisory board working to defund the very watchdogs investigating that company. When you book an Airbnb, your credit card is charged in full immediately. The host does not receive their payment until 24 hours after check-in. Airbnb is holding the accumulated float from bookings paid but not yet fulfilled. Multiply 500 million nights by an average hold time and you arrive at this number. The number has grown every year without interruption. $9.2 billion by fiscal year 2025. That is not a bank deposit pool. It is categorized as a liability. In 2021, with the Federal Reserve's benchmark rate near zero, that yield generated $12 million. Then the Fed started moving. Float interest income, 2021, $12 million, increasing by 6,300% to $685 million in 2025. The Federal Reserve moved its benchmark rate from 0 to 5.5%, and Airbnb collected the yield on $9 billion of other people's money. In 2023, 28% of the company's operating profit came from parking your vacation money in government bonds. That is the answer to the first open loop. That is how a company that owns zero properties became a financial operation. In 2017, the Italian parliament passed a law requiring digital platforms facilitating short-term rentals to collect and remit a 21% income tax. The law was simple. It was legal. It had a clear statutory basis. Airbnb's finance and legal teams reviewed it. They understood it, and then they decided not to comply. For 6 consecutive years, the company argued before European courts that it was an information society provider, a neutral bulletin board. The non-compliance was a competitive price advantage. It was also a systematic shift of tax evasion risk from the company onto the individual Italian host. Between 2017 and 2023, Airbnb contested Italian tax law while benefiting from the price advantage created by non-collection. In November 2023, Milan public prosecutors ran out of patience. The Guardia di Finanza executed a precautionary criminal seizure of 779 million euros, a criminal freeze, not a regulatory fine. Cornered with its liquidity frozen, Airbnb settled on December 13th, 2023. 576 million euros, 621 million US dollars to resolve 6 years of unpaid withholding liabilities. And then, publicly, Airbnb announced it would absorb the entire payment. They would not seek to recover any portion from the individual Italian hosts. Why? Because pursuing hosts would have required the company to publicly confirm that it had knowingly facilitated non-compliance. The settlement was cheaper than the admission. There is a unit inside Airbnb that the company has never officially named in any public filing. Internally, it is called the Black Box Team. Approximately 100 specialists recruited from military, intelligence, and emergency medical backgrounds deployed globally to respond to worst-case scenarios. Bloomberg Businessweek documented the unit through unsealed court records published in June 2021. The defining case. New Year's Eve 2015. A 24-year-old Australian woman was raped at knife point in a midtown Manhattan Airbnb. A career criminal had accessed the apartment using a duplicate key retrieved from a nearby bodega. The black box team responded. The victim was relocated to a luxury hotel. Her mother was flown from Australia. Medical and psychiatric costs were covered. A settlement was negotiated, $7 million. The victim was required to sign a non-disclosure agreement barring her from discussing the settlement. A $7 million settlement. Non-disclosure agreement. No public court record. The platform continued to call incidents exceptionally rare. $7 million is not the number that matters. The number that matters is the one that does not exist. The total of every settlement like it. Conducted in private through mandatory arbitration behind NDAs. No public docket, no press access, no precedent, no visible pattern. Court depositions reference over 35,000 customer support tickets related to surveillance and recording devices since 2013. The company's response was to manage those tickets through its internal trust and safety system, monitoring for repeat offenders and settling claims. What the company did not do: proactively sweep properties. Require hosts to certify the absence of recording devices through third-party inspection. In July 2024, CNN published an investigation. Digital servers in host properties containing thousands of hours of illicitly captured footage. In March 2024, Airbnb was featured in a Saturday Night Live sketch about hidden cameras. 2 weeks after the sketch aired, Airbnb announced a global ban. Global indoor camera ban, April 30th, 2024. Enforcement, self-reported by guests. 11 years after the first support tickets. 3 months after SNL enforcement is entirely reliant on guest discovery. The verification mechanism does not exist. March 2023. A fire in a historic building in Old Port, Montreal. The property had no fire escapes. 7 people died. June 28, 2024. A structural fire at an Airbnb cabin in Necedah, Wisconsin. 6 family members did not survive. In June 2025, attorneys filed a sweeping lawsuit alleging that Airbnb markets properties that are entirely unlicensed and unverified for basic life safety equipment. Airbnb's position was identical. The property is owned and controlled by a third party. The host self-certified compliance. Airbnb's contractual indemnification clauses shift all fire and safety liability to the property owner. The platform collects its 16%. The liability is the host's. The risk is the guest's. Here is the question that connects everything this video has covered. When a company's single most profitable operation depends on holding your cash for as long as possible, does the incentive structure of that float shape every other decision the company makes? Does it explain why the liability architecture is constructed to externalize risk? Does it explain why the NDA is the preferred resolution mechanism for violent incidents rather than the public court record? We will answer that directly in the verdict. But first, the cracks in the current operation. April 2020. Airbnb is burning $250 million per month. International borders are closed. The platform's gross booking value has collapsed 80% in 8 weeks. The company's private valuation has dropped from 31 billion to 18 billion. And here is the detail that reveals exactly what Airbnb is when the market stops moving. The company has almost no liquid assets it actually owns. Its cash is guest deposits it is holding. The real estate generating that deposit float belongs to other people. The moment bookings stop, the float drains, and the float draining means the treasury operation stops. Silver Lake and Sixth Street Partners arrived on April 6, 2020. They brought $1 billion. The terms were punitive: a 10% interest rate, LIBOR plus 7.5 with a 1% floor, and warrants to purchase equity at 18 billion. Stock warrants at 18 billion versus 31 billion prior valuation. 8 days later, a second billion arrived at 9%. In the same weeks, Chesky made a unilateral decision that would define the company's relationship with hosts permanently. Facing massive guest cancellations, he invoked Airbnb's extenuating circumstances policy and issued 100% cash refunds to guests. Overriding the cancellation policies hosts had individually set for their own properties, hosts received nothing. The financial damage to professional hosts, people with mortgages and property management commitments, was severe. A platform revolt began. To contain it, Chesky announced a $250 million host relief fund, promising to pay hosts 25%. Internal documents subsequently revealed that thousands of professional hosts were disqualified on minor procedural grounds. The fund preserved Airbnb's cash. It also permanently damaged the company's relationship with a meaningful segment of its most productive supply. To this day, the host revolt of 2020 is the reason over 70% of professional property managers use centralized channel managers to cross-list inventory. Airbnb is no longer the default. It is one channel among several. The reason traces to 1 week in March 2020, when the platform decided that guest trust was more valuable than host loyalty, and turned out to be right about the financial outcome. In 2024, financial media reported that Airbnb's net income had collapsed from 4.79 billion in 2023 to 2.6 billion. What actually happened requires a brief but important detour into accounting standards. Under US GAAP, when a company accumulates years of operating losses, it records deferred tax assets, future tax deductions sitting on the balance sheet as potential value. In late 2023, Airbnb met that threshold. The 2023 record profit of 4.79 billion was 2.09 billion actual performance plus a 2.70 billion non-cash accounting release. The entire narrative was an artifact of accounting mechanics. In 2025, Airbnb spent $3.8 billion repurchasing its own shares. The buyback program is not building value for shareholders. 3.8 billion in buybacks produced only 1.7% share count reduction. It is preventing visible dilution from the equity compensation machine. Airbnb's stock-based compensation consumes 24.5% of its operating cash flow. As of mid-2026, with the Federal Reserve lowering rates toward 4.5%, the float's annual interest income is compressing. At 3%, the rate most central bank models project, that income compresses to roughly $276 million. That is a $500 million annual headwind to operating income, roughly equivalent to banning Airbnb in 3 major European cities simultaneously. The regulatory walls are real and they are moving. New York City's Local Law 18 activated in September 2023. Within 6 months, active Airbnb listings in the city collapsed from approximately 38,000 to under 3,000, a 92% reduction. In one of the company's highest average daily rate global markets, where North American bookings generate a $215 average daily rate, Barcelona has formally committed to revoking every one of its 10,000 tourist apartment licenses by 2028. Paris is tightening occupancy caps. Each regulatory action directly reduces the float. Fewer active listings means fewer active bookings. Fewer bookings means fewer deposits held, lower treasury yield. The expanding markets, Latin America, Asia Pacific, are growing rapidly. Indian origin bookings surged 50% year over year in Q4 2025, but Latin American listings generate average daily rates of $98. Asia Pacific 121, North America 215. The mathematical gap between what is being lost to regulation and what is being gained through expansion is not currently closing. Here is what Airbnb does genuinely well. Three things: specific, earned, and real. First, the direct traffic moat is one of the most valuable structural advantages in consumer internet. 80% of the company's traffic arrives organically. Booking Holdings spends $8.8 billion dollars annually to generate equivalent demand. Airbnb's budget is less than $2 billion. The difference is not marginal. It is a different category of economic structure. When you become the verb, you have achieved something that money cannot buy. Second, the trust ledger is genuinely irreplicable on any near term horizon. Over 1 billion verified, time-stamped, cross-referenced reviews, not hotel star ratings, not self-reported satisfaction scores. It is the foundation of the platform's ability to scale trust at speed. Third, the financial engineering across the 2020 to 2021 period was genuinely sophisticated. The zero coupon convertible note transaction was a masterclass. The company's financial management team has demonstrated real skill at identifying and exploiting structural advantages in the capital markets. First, the liability externalization machine is not an oversight, it is an architectural choice. A company that captures 16% of every transaction while using contractual structure to shift all physical risk, fire, injury, assault, surveillance to hosts and guests has made a deliberate design decision. The hundreds of millions generated annually by holding guest deposits funds the black box team and the settlements. The cash buffer makes the externalization affordable. Second, the voting structure eliminates the institutional accountability. 80% of voting power concentrated in three individuals is not governance. It is exclusion. The Joe Gebbia Doge appointment in February 2025 was the clearest real world demonstration of what happens when there is no check on founder power. Nothing happened. Third, the float dependency creates a structural exposure to macroeconomic cycles that is not prominently disclosed to retail investors. As rates normalize and the float income compresses, the earnings quality narrative will need to be rebuilt on the operational platform margins that remain. First, build a verified safety certification layer. The cost per listing is minimal, under $100 per property. The alternative cost has been demonstrated in court. Second, implement a dual class voting sunset provision. Making it time bounded would recover some of the governance discount. Third, disclose the float and use it as a competitive weapon. It converts the company's most controversial financial mechanic into a transparent value proposition. Here is the framework. In every business model, ask this question: who holds the cash? That gap is always where the hidden business lives. Banks hold deposits, insurance companies collect premiums, retailers collect payment at the register, and Airbnb collects your money the day you book. You will see float where others see logistics. You will see structural yield where others see payment processing details. That is not an accident, it is the business. Airbnb did not invent this mechanic, but it scaled it to $9.2 billion in held deposits without ever once prominently telling the people whose money it was holding. The company that owns zero properties, employs zero housekeepers, and has never washed a single sheet is, in forensic financial terms, one of the largest unregulated custodians of consumer cash on earth. That is not an accident, it is the business. The core truth of everything this video covered in 2 sentences. Airbnb is not a hospitality company that became profitable. It is a float-funded financial intermediary that built a hospitality interface as its customer acquisition channel. And every other decision on safety, on governance, on taxes, on settlements flows from the incentive structure that float creates. When you see it that way, nothing about this company looks accidental anymore. Next, McDonald's, a company that most people think sells hamburgers. A company that is, in forensic financial terms, one of the largest real estate investment trusts in the world, owning approximately $40 billion dollars in prime global commercial property, which it rents back to the franchisees who actually operate the restaurants. Here are the two questions we will answer. If McDonald's real estate operation is worth more than its food operation, why does it still need to sell hamburgers at all? And what does it mean for every franchise owner when the company that sets their prices is also the company that owns the land beneath their feet? Strategy Lens exists for people who want to understand what is actually happening inside the institutions that shape the economy. Not the headlines, not the investor relations talking points, the architecture beneath the architecture. Subscribe because the next company we expose might be one you thought you already understood.